go ahead and get rolling. All right. So here we are to talk about big systems and big problems. So lessons learned from building 40 design systems. So, whoops, heading a little fast. My name is Kate Eiler-Wervey. I'm the Director of Solution Delivery at Palantir.net. So my area of specialty is in content strategy. I wrote a couple of books about it a couple of years back. So in internet years, they're kind of out of date, but it is still where I spend my time. And I'm presenting with Carl.
And I want to make sure, Kate, are we going to the next slide? Because I only see big systems, big problems. So I want to make sure that
Oh,
it's
do you?
working. Yeah.
Okay.
First
You're not seeing the
technical
change?
difficulty here.
Yes, the best kind. You do not see the hello slide?
Oh, they
Oh,
see
Ashley
hello?
sees it.
Okay. All right.
Excellent.
If they can see it, then I can't. So that might be interesting for me, but I will keep going. So hopefully we're on the same page. You may need to refresh. Possibly refresh. So maybe I should refresh and see if that fixes it quick. How about that?
Sure. Thomas has really got the key point here.
Okay, now I see it fine. All right. Okay, so I'm Carl Martins. I'm a senior web designer and UX architect at Palantir. So I've helped design and develop multiple design systems at Palantir, in which several of those have actually been award-winning. So, okay, I'm not seeing the slide switch. Is it switched to the next slide?
It is switched.
Okay. All right.
Sad day.
All right, well, I'll just keep going. So before we get started with the presentation, we want to do a quick definition of terms as we walk through this. So a design system is a series of elements and components and templates that can be reused in different combinations to construct consistent on-brand pages. So we start with the smallest, which would be elements. Those would be your typographical things, your buttons, different things like that, which then feed into components where a combination of those pieces, which will eventually lead into bigger pieces that you can basically put together within a template. The underlining idea is to change our thinking of pages into reusable components and templates. Component-based design is how we make everything scalable. So the templates ensure the client has a vision of the final product while providing guidance to content writers and developers as we build out Drupal sites.
Right, and to build on this, just to talk briefly about why design systems are so essential. So a lot of the design system discourse is really technical. The focus is on creating consistent interfaces across multiple systems and screens. But the value of a design system for a CMS is a little different. So the job of a design system in a CMS is to deliver content. There's often thousands and thousands of pages of it. So design systems enable CMS sites to deliver content in a way that's beautiful and consistent and user-friendly. So this design that Carl created for ETF has won several awards. It's gotten consistently high reviews from users, but it's really in a crisis where the design system shines. So ETF was able to use their own in-house resources to spin up really comprehensive COVID-19 communications. And we built that system in 2018, so it's very definitely in the before times. The key here is that while COVID-19 and all that supporting content is new, best practices for organizing and displaying information online is not. And a big part of the value of a design system is to support urgent and unforeseen communication needs on short notice. So the single biggest lesson we've learned from building 40 plus design systems is that great design systems are built by interdisciplinary teams. So the titles are going to differ from org to org. But essentially what you need is a content expert, a design expert, an engineering expert, and a business expert. So that's a lot of people to wrangle up, and that can sound kind of time consuming and expensive. But in our experience, this approach isn't just better, it's faster and it's cheaper. And the reason why it's cheaper and faster and better is because misaligned teams create product and client team relationship issues. And so this is a really common domino chain problem we've experienced, where the designers create designs and interfaces that the content and the data don't actually support. Then they throw it over the wall to the engineers, who point out that the designs that at this point the client really loves can't be built either within the current budget or maybe even at all. And now we have to make it work, or we have to go have a hard conversation with the client that ends with them either paying more than they expected or getting less than they expected. Now your team's mad at each other, client's unhappy. So getting the content design, engineering, and business people working together early and often prevents that whole daisy chain.
So the chief difficulty is keeping the team aligned for everyone to get their work done. So we have to realize that everyone has basically their own type of deliverable or output that they're working with. So there's visual design, there's Word docs, there's code, there's spreadsheets. In order to build a shared understanding, we need a common language. So the most effective cross-team collaboration we've found is actually sketching. So working together to sketch. Each type of practitioner can sketch at varying degrees of fidelity and with varying degrees of skills as well. So you don't have to be a good sketcher at any point to be able to kind of work together as a group to have a shared understanding of what everything means. So what about this? With sketching, the team is creating a shared understanding and then translating that understanding into individual disciplines and tasks that they have to take on their own. With that, the client is also getting some hand-on education on how the site will flow and function, as well as starting to get introduced into the editorial process. And this is huge because really the project success, at least from the client's perspective, hinges on, is this editorial experience working well for me and my team? If it's a little bit clunky, or if it's just not very intuitive, or it's not getting the job done, then that means that the strategist, designer, and the engineer haven't done their part.
So let's talk about details. We've got this into a couple of sections. The first is how from scratch, from the start, you start identifying your components. And next up, talking about building that team alignment and how to do it. And then we're going to talk about documenting your system and then close it out with like a really quick TLDR. So before you get to sketch, there's some groundwork that needs to be laid first. And the key concept for this section is really that for a CMS, a design system should be built to serve the content. So in other words, the first step to successfully building a good design system is to assess and prioritize the content that you're designing for. So at Palantir, this task is typically owned by a strategist or even an engineer rather than a designer. So we're starting our cross-team collaboration right out of the gate. Now, when I say that a design system should serve the content, this is what I mean. We're going to take a look at these two examples of the same component. So these two tabbed components, I pulled those screenshots off the same page, one element apart. So that's the same thing, and they're containing two completely different types of content. One of them is a list of programs, and the other is an FAQ. The thing is, they look the same. So they're providing the visitors zero cues about the information that each component is conveying. And this doesn't work because people don't read online, they scan. And for a website that serves thousands of pages of content, the most important thing we can do to reduce noise and increase ease of use is to provide visual cues about written content for people who are scanning. And when you use the same visual design to serve different types of content, you're forcing your readers to slow down and read at a much more detailed level than they prefer. Some of those visitors are going to leave. And I feel like I ought to at least say that I had to go back into the Wayback Machine to get these. DeVry has since done a redesign and fixed this problem. So your first step to creating your component list, your just list of components that we're going to build, is to assess and prioritize your content. And so the steps here are basically three. You want to start with what's the site's job. You want to stop and think about what the site actually has to do. What's the business reason it exists? And what are the key business user and end goals for the site? So if you're a health system, then it's like the fundamental reason that that site exists is patient acquisition. So you want to start there. And then next, you want to start thinking about the key flows that deliver against that key business and user goal set. And if you're trying to acquire patients, then those are things like finding a doctor, making an appointment. Sometimes it's that front page triage. And then the next step after that is once you've got your core flows, you can just start bashing out a list of the types of content that will persuade and inform or even delight your visitors into converting. And for health systems, that can be clear, short, up-to-date information on cutting-edge treatments. It's doctor profiles, things like that. And at this stage of the proceedings, typically we just have a big list. And then the next step from that is to start thinking about differentiating your content. So the kinds of things you want to be asking yourself is, hey, does this type of content need its own component? You're looking at things like the structure. What are the core elements? Does it need to be locked down to certain fields? Does it need to be more flexible? You want to look at how it's being created and its constraints. Is the content created on this page? Is it being pulled in from a different node or a third-party integration? What control do we have? And then also, is it important? Is this content really necessary to help move visitors forward in their journey? So that's sort of the high look, but I want to hand it over to Carl to talk through an example.
Yeah, so the example we're going to be using today is actually our own website, so Palantir.net. We're actually going through a redesign process right now, and we thought this would be a good candidate to be able to walk through this stuff, is because we can essentially show you all of the messy behind-the-scenes stuff that we're currently working on. So before we do anything, we want to take a snapshot. We want to look at what the current site looks like, and really kind of ask ourselves the question, does the design system serve the content currently? And the answer is actually no. The homepage does need quite a bit of help. You could basically say, where do people click when they get here? There are no defined sections, no labels, just similar looking components in a big list. So the design system is not serving the content very well in this state. So basically, before we do anything, before we get into sketching or kind of thinking about mocking things up or anything like that, we have to ask ourselves the question, what is Palantir.net's job? And to do that, we need to be thinking with the client, what are the business goals, what are the audience goals, and what are the metrics and KPIs or key performance indicators that are important for the website to do its job? And so we throw all of those out, and we essentially start to create what we call a mapping matrix of these, where we can start to pull threads between relationships of business goals to audience goals, and then to and then to the KPIs. And what this essentially does is it gives us a roadmap for the different sections and features and destinations that people will have when they're on the website. We then can use that to reorder, we can use that to prioritize the order of the list as well, which basically gives us an idea of what's most important for us to complete within the timeline that we have for the project. So from there, we can start looking from a high level at the user flows. But first, the way that we define user flows is this. A user flow is a complete path a user takes when using a website to complete a task. The user flow lays out the user's movements to the website, mapping out each and every step that the user takes, from the entry point right through to the final interaction that they have. So really, all these user flows are doing is illustrating the goals that we have within the matrix on the previous slide. So the examples that we came up with here to identify would be Palantir's proven solutions, technical strategic thought leadership, and then careers at Palantir. So just to name a few. So to look at one of these as an example, we have proven solutions. And the question really is, has Palantir solved my problem before? And we basically just want to have we want to create a high level look at this. We want to kind of take the 30,000 foot view of what the potential path that a user might have as they navigate through a given task that they might have. So we think about, what are the entry points? So maybe they're coming to their home page, maybe it's a side door, maybe through Google, something like that. You know, what's kind of the in-between page? Maybe it's a service line type page where they can get a little bit more information about answering the question, you know, has Palantir solved this problem? And then lastly, what are the actions that they're taking? So what pages are they getting to where they can actually start to take action and potentially find a solution or work with Palantir? What's also great about this is that it validates the budget and timeline with the client. So in conversations that we have with the client, we're really starting to understand the complexity of these user flows as well. You might come into these thinking that it might be pretty simple, and then going through this exercise might identify that it's much more complex than you originally thought. So from there, we're wanting to find what is the content that serves these particular flows. And to do this, we basically want to be thinking about, what is the audience care about when they're interacting with these different types of templates, right? So so basically what we're wanting to do here is just take inventory of what those potential components and pieces of content might be within a given flow. And what's great about this is it really allows us to focus specifically on completing this particular task. We're not bloating the overall inventory of components or pieces of content that we want to build for the site, but rather making it a little bit more lean and specific to serving a specific goal and task that a user would have. So those things could be maybe a list of case studies or different awards listings or blog posts, things like that that we'd want to be able to list out at this point. So once we have identified our list of content, now we can start to basically kind of rough out our content model. And we just use Google Spreadsheets for this. It's easy for us to kind of enter the specifics at this point into a spreadsheet. And this is typically done by a strategist or an engineer. But we start to take a look at what type of content we're looking at. So for instance, we can start to identify what is the narrative content that a content editor would need to be interacting with or create. And typically that would be content that you can find on a landing page, a news section, or a blog section. And really what we're trying to do here is just take quick inventory of what are those pieces of information, what are those fields and elements that basically build out narrative type content. But along with that, we can also start looking at the database-driven content as well. So database-driven content is content that's stored on the server and served through the database. The example that we typically use for this would be like a doctor profile. That's content that's usually being served in and presented on the page through structured data. So for data-driven content, the key is to have a good working understanding of what type of data is available to us to be able to push. There's been situations in the past where either a team member or a client asks a question like, wouldn't it be cool if we can show the insurance policies of what the doctor accepts on their profile page? And the answer could be, yeah, that's really cool. If we could do that, but does the data actually exist? Is it in the database? If it is, that's cool. We can show it. If it's not, then we know that content can't be displayed. We can't show that particular content on that given page. So what this is doing is really helping us give guiding rules for what's available as we progress down the path.
So starting with content in this way and even doing this sort of rough content modeling and database analysis is doing a couple of things for us. Again, it's really validating that project scope and budget and timeline. During the sales process, you make guesses based on like sort of a high level look. Roughing this work out helps you map that to the actual content and the actual site and validate it. And at this stage, if it turns out that actually you need more budget, it's a much easier time to have that conversation with the client because either they can get it or they can say like, actually, let's pivot and think about this a slightly different way. And it's also really helpful to us, we found, just for client coaching. Our clients are typically, they own the process of content creation and proliferation. And this is sort of like a nice introductory way for them to start like mapping out the buckets and understanding how the site is constructed and even getting an introduction to the idea of sort of building pages with components. So key takeaways from this section on identifying components are really content first all the way, and you want to prioritize your components and your templates based on the outcomes the site needs to deliver. You can always make more components and things. There's always more things that you could design than you have time and space for, and so you prioritize based on outcomes. And then you can differentiate based on content structure, and that helps people scan. So once we've got that nice groundwork laid, we've got the baseline, and from here you can actually start creating. So what we're going to talk about next is actually how to build that alignment across your team. So the key concept here is that it's the content model that links design and engineering. So design systems serve content. That means the link between the designers and the engineer is the model. It's the hinge or the point of alignment between the two practices. So the challenge is that a content model looks like this. And we used to try to put this in front of our clients to get their input and ask our designers to design with this in mind. And it's just too hard. Clients know how they want websites to work. but they don't know how to translate that knowledge into evaluating a content model spreadsheet. It's just not an interface that they can really work effectively with. And so it's up to us to frame our questions in a way that the clients can effectively answer. And the way we found to do that is sketching. It's the best way to frame questions, not just for clients, but for every member of the team to be able to sort of bat back ideas back and forth on. And we've started pulling sketching early as possible, starting some very low fidelity work. And what we've really found is that this visual method has been really game changing for our work, both internally as a team and with our clients. So back to Carl.
Yeah, so continuing on the example that we're using for Palantir.net, now it's time to get everyone in the room and start sketching, right? But being a remote first company, that doesn't actually mean we're all literally getting in a room and going to a whiteboard. That means we have to get on video calls and use some sort of virtual whiteboard to do this. We personally use InVision Freehand for sketching. But honestly, you can use whatever you feel comfortable with or what your client might prefer to work with, but that's specifically what we use. So for reference, we want to look back at our user flow, okay? We've done this great work of mapping out what users are going to be doing, where their entry points are, where their touch points are, and we can get a pretty good idea about what are the general templates or even Drupal content types that we're going to need to be thinking about as we move forward through sketching. We roughly know the components and the content as well. Again, we created that content list. We were starting to identify narrative content versus database-driven content. So we have that information stored as well. And most importantly, we have a mapped out flow to guide us through the next steps of sketching. So taking a first look here at sketching, we basically want to start looking at very rough and kind of crude looking examples here. We want to be asking very, very simple and straightforward questions to get to the root of what people are actually doing when they navigate through a given flow. So we'd be asking questions with the client, with the strategist and engineer and the designer in the room. How will the audience get to this content, right? So maybe they're starting from the home page and they click on a certain button into maybe a services page. Or maybe they're bypassing that fully and they're heading to one of those interior pages directly from the side door through a Google search. What do they expect to see first, next, and last? Again, we're giving a path forward of what they're seeing specifically from one page to the next. Maybe they're having to navigate down the page to get to information once they navigate in. And then also, what is the final action the user is taking? So again, we want to be able to map the full user flow out here, but we want to make sure that we're really capturing what the final destination is. What is the final interaction that the user is doing to make this a successful user flow? So very simple user flows at that point. So once we've mapped out and sketched out those user flows, we can start to bring a little bit more fidelity into this as well and really start to validate the page level strategy. And we're wanting to ask questions like, is this feature idea possible to build with the data that we have? Or how should this content be interrelated? Is this content going to be connecting to another piece of content, or is it going to be strictly just information they can read on this page? Or should we move this content up or down on the page? And again, these are conversations that you want to make sure that you're having with your strategist and client to make sure that everyone's on the same page, because there might be something that comes out of that where you identify, actually we want to move this featured work above industries because it meets this particular business goal or this KPI conversion that we want to have. And during this step within sketching, it's really, really crucial that we can do that, because we can identify those key decisions very, very early on. So as we go through that, we're then going to be moving into the next stage of sketching, where we're dealing with a little bit more fidelity at this point. So chances are you've probably already done wireframes, you've maybe even done some comped out work. And at this point within your sketch session, you're really trying to validate the content model, okay? So you're gonna be asking questions like, where's this content coming from? Is it manual or generated? how much content should be listed on a given page. You can identify maybe there's a display of 3, maybe there's 4 or 5, as well as, maybe we want to have a 2-up column or a 4-up column. These are great decisions to be able to be had in a sketch session, just because, again, you're getting everyone involved in your answering these questions without any sort of issue with people following along. You could also be asking questions such as, how structured should this content be? Maybe it's content that should be narrative or data-driven, as well as you can be thinking about, what is the experience going to be like in the Drupal administrative side? So you can start mapping things out a little bit more from that side of things as well. So for instance, in this example that we have, we can identify that we might want a curated list of featured work, but the admin might want to be able to reorder that information as they see fit. Well, we can simply sketch that out and provide kind of an illustration of what that actually means, or we could even throw in a screenshot of a Drupal admin reordered list to give them an idea of what that experience might be from the editorial side. Again, it's really important to be able to get the buy-in from the client at this point of how they're going to be interacting with the client, not only from the front end, but then also from the back end. So through sketching, we're gaining a lot of great information, a lot of great annotative information through note-taking and all of that information. But now it's time to translate that alignment into the actual work that we're doing. We're wanting to basically take all of that information that we're doing and put it into the outputs of how we're going to be writing our tickets, how we're going to be creating our content model spreadsheet. So there's going to be refinement that we have within that. And then also, what is the final output? What is the prototype going to look like as well? So from an alignment of the tickets, one thing that we found to be really, really beneficial is how we name our tickets. So there's different disciplines, there's different jobs that certain tickets will have. One might be dedicated to building out the prototype, one might be for implementing it in Drupal, and the other one might be theming. But what we found is creating a consistent naming convention for this really creates a consistent path all the way through, and really kind of makes everything kind of talk to each other. So for instance, the way that we name components or name a component is we give it a prefix of component. We then give it the name of the actual component name, such as highlight, and then we add whatever discipline or role of that particular ticket might have at the end. So prototyping and implementation and so on. So the actual information going on within each of the tickets might be specific for that given role or that job that someone has, but they all interconnect. And then what we also can start doing is refining our content model as well. So we've done all this great work within the sketch sessions to build out shared understanding of what particular components do, where things will interconnect, and all of that sort of stuff. And from here, we can start to refine that a bit more and give a little bit more concrete rules put in place specifically for the content model. After all, this is really kind of a centralized kind of documentation system that we use, where the strategist, designer, and engineer can all reference this data. The designer will need to be able to use this for the actual development of the markup, where the engineer is going to be building this in the implementation. And then the client is also going to be needing the naming conventions as well, as they're kind of using the editorial experience as well. So we want to make sure that everything's consistent from the content model. And then lastly, it's really the alignment of the prototype here. So based off of the tickets and content model, we can create a well-structured template prototype that stays true to the sketches that we first started working on when everyone was in the room. There really are no surprises at this point when we have this prototype. The client's happy because they have a display that achieves the goals that they set out for. The strategist and designer are happy because of the user flows and the page level strategy that we put into it. And then the engineer is happy because we have the code that is integrated within the prototype will be seamless as it goes into the Drupal implementation. So as we take a step back and look at where we were and where we are now, you can see that there's quite a bit of difference between the display of these. Both essentially have the same content, but the new template has set goals through conversation and through sketching to produce a much more refined experience for the end user. Going through the process of identifying the job of the site, creating user flows for key experiences, and sketching for shared understanding for team members and the tasks they are working on.
So yeah, when it comes to the problems that this approach solves, it's really about keeping the entire project team, product owner, designers, strategists, engineers, client in alignment early through the entire process. This is also just a really effective way for engaging our clients in the editorial question of how the site should be run. I'm sure everybody's been in that position where the client has tried to create something on a page and realize it doesn't do what they expect. I don't see that anywhere near as much anymore. From a business owner standpoint, it's very important to be able to maintain alignment on scope and deliverables, which this really helps with. And just from a sheer helps us keep a shared naming convention, which makes content creation and proliferation a lot easier. So our key takeaway from this is that even though there's a lot more people involved, it is nevertheless better and faster and ultimately cheaper. And that sketching is a really effective common language. That first flow that Carl showed is one of mine. I can't draw for toffee, no problem. Putting that stuff down is much faster to write a big document explaining what my theory of a user flow is. And ultimately the end goal here is that the client gets a platform that works the way that they want and expect in the budget that they planned for. So this last little section is pretty short. It's just a quick look at how we document our systems. And the key thing I really want to hit on here is that the design system is giving your content admins the strategic. Clients are using the visual design as the guide to the back-end editing experience. And today a little bit about the content admin struggles with the admin UI. That's definitely been our experience too. So when content admins are sitting down to create and publish pages, having like a picture of the ideal page in front of them gives them the context they need to actually build out a good site. We put all of this energy in this whole process, identifying the goals and designing for content and user flows. But when you hand off the site to the admins who own and are building it, they may or may not have participated in that process. And that mattered less back when we were using Stripe because they didn't have a lot of choices. So documentation was pretty easy. But the thing is that a CMS admin interface is really good about enforcing elements and components of a design system, provide much pages. And we want our content admins to know how to use the design system to deliver the best experience it can. So at Palantir, in fact, it's called a style guide. And we use real content to the extent that we can, which includes showing these fully constructed pages in their ideal state. And that's been that's a huge key piece of our documentation at this point. When I say blueprint, I really do mean exactly that. Like a component-based design system gives your content admins a lot of freedom. And providing page-level blueprints provides some basic guardrails. And ultimately, it's their content. They'll build them how they want. And I don't know, the way we sort of think about it is that it's like I can't stop a client from picking like a really ugly linoleum, but I can at least make sure that the windows are in the right place. And this type of documentation helps.
Yeah, so documentation is an important step for once content editors can access the site and start entering in content, as well as once the site goes live. They can use this documentation to reference what was done prior and just make sure that they're building and structuring content correctly for the future. So what we want to do is we basically want to document a lot of the work that we've done along the way within this process. And the first thing is documenting the key template flows that we created. So by doing this, what we're really doing is providing them some guidance on how to make sure that that the content is structured in a way and really as intended for the user flow. A lot of times clients will lose sight of flows when they're working once we're past development and the site goes live, and they just start adding in a lot of content. But what this documentation really does is it allows to give them the blueprint, or really kind of the way to make sure that they're still in alignment with those particular flows that we felt were very extremely important early on in the process. What we also want to do is really document the component options here as well. So we take a look at a given template. So example, we're looking at a case study here. And really what this does is it provides just good definition around what's available to these content editors as they're ready to build out these pages. We provide basically a brief purpose of what this template is for, as well as laying out all of the different types of components that they could be using. We also identify if it's an editable block, or maybe if it's a generated block, or something that might be statically created. And again, that just gives them some insight in terms of if this is narrative content or if it's being data-driven. What's also great about this is that we're also aligning with the naming conventions that we came across early on within the content model as well, as well as within sketching. So for instance, all of the different names that we have within the components are consistent with what we have within the markup, which is consistent in the content model, and of course, which is consistent within the Drupal backend as well. So when the client's looking at this guide, they can see, okay, static block, that's the component name. If I go back into the administrative area, I can see static block is the same exact name that we have for this particular component. And then lastly, we want to make sure that we're giving them a well laid out prototype essentially to look at and to reference. We use real content when we put these together, really whenever we possibly can. And really what this does is it provides a good blueprint for them to know how much content is really expected for a given component. We don't want to necessarily just put in lorem ipsum, or have them kind of decide how much content should exist in certain components, because they might not be designed for that. So this gives a bit of content governance to the content editors as well as they move forward once the site is live.
All right, so the problems this type of documentation solves is that it basically it gives a little bit more guardrails for the freedom of a component-based system, and it gives the content admins that strategic context to make really the best decisions they can. Every member of any team wants to understand the larger context of their work, and this is a pretty good way to get it to them. And yeah, our key takeaways for this one are really that the design system or the style guide is the blueprint for clients, as opposed to the Drupal admin, that our content admins need that higher level context. And that, boy, if you have real content in your prototypes, it's a huge asset. It removes a lot of the guesswork, and it's a lot more accessible than like a 1,000,000-page training PDF. So if you read one section, if you're coming back on this later, the top line is that building a great design system requires an interdisciplinary team. You're gonna need a content person, a design person, an engineering person, and a business person. Even though that's a lot of persons, it is still better and faster and cheaper.
So interdisciplinary team has to have a shared language to collaborate well. So sketching is the way. Again, we found that to be the best way possible to do this, because it's fast, it's lo-fi, and it's really just easy for everyone to jump in. So if you do one thing specifically from watching this presentation, is to look at your process and identify the points where you can slot in collaboration across your strategist, designer, engineer, and client as early and often as possible. We want to make sure that we're sketching together, we're naming things together, we're iterating together. Trust me, a lot of these people have great insights when it comes to making a better product. So sketching to ask questions is the common language that we can all understand.
And that is that. So thank you. I see a couple of good, super awesome questions popping up in chat. So I'm just going to start from the bottom up, which is, how do you get the client to get you content before design? Slowly and painfully is the answer to that one. It's very tricky. setting early expectations and setting early milestones. We actually ask our clients this most recently, we've had most success with asking them to bring draft copy to a sketch session. And what you're doing is you're lowering the bar for, like, it doesn't have to be done, it doesn't have to be approved, you don't have to run it through 8 billion people. Just put something on a page that you think is about right, and we're going to go sketch with it, and get them in the habit of thinking about it as like an iterative climb instead of like it's done, hand off. And frankly, though, it's still quite difficult. A lot of clients do like to kick the can down the road.
Oh, they do. What else we have?
Let's see. Greg, on the hours a day and a week of collaboration, does that translate into? I can't give you a top line number, but what I can say is from a project management point of view, the way that we plan the work at this point is that it's like the meeting, the sketch session is the work. So we've got like here's the sketch session. These are the people that need to be participatory. This is the size of the ticket. And so it's not like an add-on to the work, it is the planned work itself. So it makes it much easier to incorporate into budgeting. It took us a while to hit on to that. But that was like a real game changer in terms of like managing it from a project management point of view.
There was a question here for how long did it take you guys to end up with this refined process? The answer is long time. Yeah, I mean, it's the thing is that a lot of it is trial and error and just iterating upon things that you know work. Coming across the sketch session piece was just something that just happened because we wanted to get our ideas just out on a board. So being that we couldn't work together in a single room, we had to find some other solution to do that. And we were finding that internally, that was making a lot of sense in order for us to kind of get to answers faster, as well as posing new questions that we weren't maybe thinking about if we were in a different type of medium. And really all we did was open that gate a little bit more into getting the client involved. So yeah, this refined process has taken a long time, but it's working well.
And I saw a really good question up thread about, this is from Chris Green. How do you approach creating a design system for an enterprise that has many different groups with so many unique needs? That is actually the ETF problem. That's the first design system that we showed. That's the Wisconsin Department of Employee Trust Funds. So that's one where we actually did a top task. The first time we did a top task analysis. And we've since incorporated into virtually all of our work because it really does help like understand, like identify the actual tasks people are trying to achieve and get them into a priority ranking that matches people's expectations. And this is really interesting because I was in a really good session today about this where people were talking about using personas. And my experience, personas of limited use in this space, what you want to think about is clusters of intent. Or tasks, like what are people here trying to do and what's their mental map for where they would look to do that thing. So a persona, reasonable people can disagree, but I think about that one as more of like a brand thing, like if you're trying to convey like tone as opposed to if you're trying to like understand like how to organize information.
One thing I'll add to that as well, within the goals matrix map that we were showing earlier, the audience goals really depends on what audience you're trying to serve. We do identify different types of audiences that we're dealing with, but we're really looking specifically what is the outcome that they're looking, or what is the task that they're trying to achieve within this. And that's enough for us to get the ball rolling in terms of really identifying what are these key user flows that we need to worry about.
Carl, you want to tackle that one about the design assets?
If I can find it.
How do you store your design assets and share them with the client for review?
So design assets, when it comes to design assets, we use InVision for presentation purposes. We just like freehand, there's a suite of different applications that you can use, and one of them is basically just display your information or display your presentation information through one of those particular applications within InVision. So that's how we typically have them see it within the presentation, but then also they can do inline commenting within there as well, so we can have a collaboration with them in terms of kind of feedback loop, essentially, with that.
There's a question in here on, have you ever given a client a shopping list of components for them to choose from to make it easier? The answer is no, because what we're doing is we want to get them focused on what we're trying to get achieved through this page. And so our team knows that list of components, but we don't give the client that list of a la carte things to choose from. Largely because like it's not their job to know what components do the best job, it's our job. Our job is to make sure we really understand what they're trying to achieve.
Right.
How detailed is the design system documentation? Carl, you are so good at documentation. I'm gonna want to talk about that one briefly. Do you add reasoning behind which elements and components to use and for which cases and scenarios, etc.?
We go a little bit further in depth within our style guide. So it's kind of an appended piece of the documentation. So the documentation is really more of kind of like a broad stroke kind of recommendation and outline of user flows, templates, and components. We do give a little bit more guidance within the actual style guide, though, where we can actually give a little bit more details specifically within that. We use Pattern Lab as our style guide vehicle to kind of deliver this stuff. And again, there's basically kind of like a developer's notes area that we can fill out within there, where we can explain a little bit more specifically on kind of build governance.
And I'm sort of popping around, so sorry, but Paul, I see this great question about like, don't want to be overly picky, but I think of a design system as something that sits on top of a set of sites as opposed to describing the overall design architecture of a single site or project. That may be a labeling description. I will tell you straight out that like I've had many a conversation about these exact definitions of terms. I know one of like the big divisions that I've experience talking to folks is really the difference between like a CMS or like a platform versus a product or an app where you might have like 10 screens or 5 screens versus like thousands of pages. So one of the big conversations that I've been a part of is what's the role of content in a design system at all? And what we're really, the stance that we have chosen to take over here is that it's central, that design is about meaning, it's about conveying meaning and helping people learn, and that trying to design in the absence of that content is sort of not as effective as if you design with it. But you're completely right that that is a larger conversation and that terms are proliferating and maybe not used identically across practitioners.
One question here from David Loop. Do your designers have a working knowledge of how the editing experience in Drupal works and how it looks? How much does that help in the high fidelity design? So we do. We're not specifically Drupal developers, our design team, although I do have experience actually theming and building within Drupal. So I have a bit of a unique experience from that perspective. But we do want to have the designers pretty well versed in terms of not only terminology of Drupal, so views, content types, all that kind of stuff, but also what does that editorial experience look like? And that's also something that strategists within our team are really familiar with as well, because again, we want to make sure that the editorial flow for the users is really really tight and working for them, because again, it hinges on that, on the success of a project. If it's a pain to build for the content editors and for the clients, then I honestly don't think that we've done our job.
I see a question from Sarah. Where do you store the list of components and elements and have a common ground for designers and developers? So during the builds, like before the site is live, the source of truth, for lack of a better term, is the content model. And then once it's built, it lives in the style guide itself. So it's like, here's your list of components, and here's your list of elements, etc. But during the build, it's the content model. What am I missing? Oh, have you ever had to create a design system for something like a distribution? Any recommendations for planning design for many sites and mixed content, etc.? We have, and that actually also starts smickety smack with the content model, is what we found. In this case, it was they needed a central repository to feed like, I think it was like 10 products across like a huge range of devices. And a lot of what that boiled down to is like, okay, what needs to be shown on any given device? Because they're used in really different contexts. So this is a medical context. So if you're a doctor and you're trying to explain to a patient what's happening, you need a different level of fidelity than if it's just like a slide going by in a waiting room or something like that. So it was actually like quite similar. And I think, yeah, I mean, we always kind of, it's like, well, what is the job? And then you can kind of like extrapolate up and down the types of components you need based on like how to do that job in the context, if that makes any sense. I see a whole bunch of animals in the slide deck, so good. I'm glad the permissions got sorted out. So many nice things you guys are saying, thanks. I think we might have got them all.
There are too many. How many components are too many? That depends, Sarah. And too many components.
We have at least one. We have at least one that has like over 100 easily. But in fairness, that's serving both an institution of higher education and a hospital system. I don't know about Envision over Adobe XD, Carl. That's a you question.
Envision versus Adobe XD. Well, we use Sketch instead of Adobe Suite, just because we've used it for years and we're just kind of familiar and used to it, and as well as it integrates well in terms of getting our assets from Sketch into Envision. There's a plugin that we can use. But also Envision has the freehand application, which we find to be really helpful for kind of that freeform sketching, to be able to just kind of get in there, get your hands dirty, and just get your ideas put to the whiteboard.
And oh, how do you get designers to get comfortable with sketching? That's probably a car question too. I know I can't draw, so I'm just like, hey guys, blah, 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 I think it's kind of harder for designers to show things that are less polished.
Yeah, it actually really is. In fact, I tend to get a little too focused on the things that aren't important in a sketch session. So I have to refrain from trying to go a little bit too deep into making things perfectly aligned and everything. But luckily, freehand does give you just enough tools to make those types of alignment changes and different things like that. But it's pretty bare bones, so you're kind of set to just kind of deal with things not looking amazing. And I think that's what makes it great for everyone to get involved.
And from Sarah, was there difficulty in changing your process to be cross-collaborative, and how is that handled? I mean, yes, and it's sort of iterated over time. Like the sort of original idea of like, we started sketching, and this is actually for ETF. We were like, hey, that'd be really cool if we could do this thing. And we sketched out this whole thing, and everybody was really excited. And then we brought the engineer in, and the engineer was like, that would be cool. It's impossible. We were like, oh, we need to like tweak this process so that we don't run into this problem. So it wasn't like we went from like 0 to like, here's the full flowered process, so much as like, we tried something and worked pretty well, and we talked about it in retro, and we brought some more people in, and sort of it's been sort of growing in that way. We do work remotely. Like Palantir is actually remote first. We've been remote first for 3 years, more than that now. So it's actually really nice because it's kind of sketching with clients like on a whiteboard and things like that is really important and helpful on discovery. And discovery doesn't last very long. So it's nice to be able to have the sketching so you can kind of pull them back into that collaborative space. And it did help when we all had to, we didn't have to go remote. We were already there, made it a little easier. All right, going to the groups of intent. Oh, what a good question that is.
I have to read it, let's see.
Okay, I think what you're asking is that when you've got different sometimes we're fortunate and like we have one client SME who can be present and can stick with us. But other times there might be times where it's like, actually, this is this like niche piece of the business and we need to go talk to a new expert. I think
Yep.
that's what you're asking, like, how do you manage that? And the answer is that, yeah, you absolutely do have to pull in like a subject matter expert in that moment. And this is actually where identifying your flows like quite early in discovery is really critical, because what that lets you do is avoid a problem where you're like, I need to talk to the subject matter yesterday. And they're like, well, okay, that's a VP. You can't talk to them for like 2 months. But if you have those user flows up top, then you can plan it out. You can be like, great, I need to talk to X person. And they're like, well, you can't until October. And it's like, all right, then we're putting it on the Gantt in October. So it's just easier to plan everybody's time, and you're not like constantly like trying to yank new people in. And so that's like a really huge benefit of identifying those business goals and the user flows up front, because it helps everybody plan their collaborative time.
Yeah, we actually put this into practice on a recent project already, where we were needing certain subject matter experts in a certain call. And because we've outlined within the user flows when we're going to be having those discussions, we could plan to have them come in at a certain time, whatever week that was. And what's great about it is that you're going into a virtual whiteboarding, session with them. They don't necessarily need to participate in terms of sketching or doodling, although they're more than happy to do so. All they have to do is follow along. We're still controlling the conversation. We're sketching things out. And a lot of times we already have something to present to them within there as well. We've probably done some internal iteration on some sketches that we want to basically validate with them. And at that point, they're really just kind of following along as if they were watching a presentation that we were giving.
Mm-hmm. And they're correcting us as we go. I do think that's important. And one of the things that we're actually going to talk about in exhibitor hours at palantir.net is how to set up sketch sessions. Because what you can't do is just be like, welcome to the whiteboard, sketch. Like, you actually have to like set up the session, like, and facilitate it. And there's different ways to do that at different points. So this gets to this next question about how do you collect/extract the intents beforehand. And a lot of that, again, like goes all the way back up to discovery, where you're talking to your key stakeholders about what their goals. Tap tasks is really becoming a more and more integral part of our process, because it kind of cuts through the chaff of like, this is what people are coming to your site to do. Like, there it is. And that helps too. So you kind of like pull up the business and the audience goals and start aligning them very early. And that helps you put together some hypotheses of intent, essentially. And then like a lot of the sketch sessioning, as Carl says, is about validating that. And sometimes like the sketch session is a lot more like a presentation. And sometimes it's like, oh no, you guys have missed a really key point, and we have to like kind of crumple it back up. You want to crumple it back up at sketching. All right, that was a lot of questions. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, thank you.
Well over, so probably we should release everyone back into the wild to play trivia. But yeah, if you want to talk more about this one, please do come to our exhibitor hours at palantir.net. And Carl is going to play the guitar, and I'm going to draw really badly, and it's going to be a great time.